and welcome to a really important conversation that I think has been peppered throughout our days together. The importance and the challenges associated with the measurement and management of impact. And we've heard about this really from the opening of our conversations. Of course, as a community, we've been talking about this for quite some time, but I think the criticality is linked to tipping point and the call for revolution, because it's at the core of our credibility as a community. This is at the core of our business case. It's at the core of our awareness case. It's at the core of product design and innovation. And what's interesting is that there has been so much energy in our community devoted to this challenge of measuring and managing impact. And yet, as we talk to folks outside of our community, the reaction back is that it's not becoming more coherent. It's not a simple message. It's not allowing us that fluidity of engagement yet with other people who are not yet part of our conversation. And so that's what we're going to try to hope to tease out today with this terrific group of panelists, some of their insights as practitioners, as some of the leading thinkers in our community who are doing this kind of work, whether it is through the business case, the product design, the galvanizing of other actors, and we really want to hear from them and learn from them. There will be a separate breakout session following the keynote this afternoon for those of you who want to take a deeper dive. So this is a bit of a framing of a conversation that we will have a chance to go a bit deeper later today. My name is Laurie Spengler. I am also a practitioner in this field. I would say relying on the people to my right and left to shine more of a spotlight and create that kind of clarity of cohesion. So that as we bring, I'm working in product innovation areas, and as we bring more products to market, it is critical that the impact management and measurement dimensions are put forth. So what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists, how do we cut through the noise? There are many, many initiatives out there, each one with a different name. Some are called frameworks, some are called principles, some are called methodologies, some are called approaches, taxonomies. How do we cut through the noise, not inside this room, but particularly as we go outside this room, to develop a more coherent and thoughtful conversation? And I'm going to begin with my far left to Clara. Barbie, if you'd share with us your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Laurie. Rather than picking one in the list that you just gave and saying that's what we should be focusing on, I think it's really important instead to think of a puzzle and the pieces that you just listed as pieces of that puzzle. So for example, ratings are one that weren't on your list but are an important one. Now, if you want to rate the impact of a product, you need to do that based on underlying metrics, or you might call them indicators or disclosures. Again, 3 words for the same thing. But you need to, that rating can only be made if you're actually basing it on underlying metrics that are agreed on. And you can only decide what metrics to agree on if you've got a conceptual framework that people buy into that says these are the sorts of metrics that you should be collecting. We think that you should be including outcome metrics. We think that you should be including demographic metrics. And you can only decide on that framework if you've actually got underlying principles that you also agree on, which might be, by the way, you need to measure both your positive and your negative impact, your intended and your unintended. So all of these things are connected like pieces of a puzzle. And rather than saying we should pick one and then that and distill and say that's the way to cut through the noise, what I urge people to do is really wrap their heads around the pieces of the puzzle and how they link together, and then tell that story. And I will just close by saying that we have a really useful analog that we shouldn't lose sight of, which is the emergence of accounting standards. It actually wasn't that long ago that the accounting standards, as we know them, came to be. There was convergence around them. And those elements that I've just described, moving from principles to framework to metrics or disclosures, and ultimately to ratings, they are an absolute mimic of what we've seen on the financial side. So we can do this.
That's fantastic, and also I love that you're optimistic, Clara, that we can navigate through. And I really appreciate it isn't about choosing, but it is figuring out what's the cohesive whole out of those component parts. And what you offered was a logic flow connectivity between and among them as we forge that puzzle together. Thank you for that. Super. Marianne, may I ask you?
Sure.
It starts, I think, by recognizing, as Clara said, there's tremendous wisdom in these frameworks and the principles because they're generally based on the experiences of those who've created them. So when the RISE Fund got started on this journey with Bridgespan, they spent nearly a year trying to learn and continue to learn from the wisdom of those. And the analogy that comes to my mind, like a puzzle, the analogy that comes to my mind is often like a train. We need definitions for what the gauge of the train track should be. We need definitions for whether we go from point A to point B or point A to point C. We also need to operationalize those. And we need to be able to say, how are we going to be safe in our operations every day? How are we going to make sure that we deliver our goods in a timely and efficient factor? And so when we think about cutting through and assessing the operational type of level of work, I think it's helpful for us to go back to a question that's really underlying the challenge of all of this, which is to say every bit of capital allocation, every bit of investment has impact. The question is that historically we've been quite poor at pricing into our decision-making the negative and the positive impacts. To what extent do our operational processes and methodologies allow this? So if I take, for example, some of the guidance that comes from the Impact Management Project about the longevity of impact, that we really do need to think about the longevity of our impact, then on our operational approach, how are we thinking about terminal value? If we're thinking about an investment for a solar opportunity with a 30-year offtake agreement, we should think about terminal value or the valuation of that impact very differently from another opportunity. Or if we're thinking about the IFC's encouragement for us to have research-based ex-ante assessments, how do we actually turn to research and determine how to use a piece of research when it is relevant to the population that we're trying to extrapolate to, whether the product or service is relevant. So I think it's at that level, at the operational level, that we can start to assess between things.
Fantastic. So I like that you focus on operationalizing, bringing things to life. But what you've also teased out in your comments, Marianne, is really the ubiquity of this application. Because I think sometimes as an impact investment community, we think that it's only our types of transactions, opportunities, market engagements that need to articulate and demonstrate the impact integrity. But actually, we all know, it applies to every capital decision.
That's right.
There's always the impact, and your remarks really tease that out. Thank you for that. Vikram, may I go to you and ask how you're cutting through and navigating through the noise and proliferation of ideas out there?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you, Laurie. I guess I have my introduction here as Asha Impact, which is an impact investing platform I set up here in India. But the other hat I have is I'm on the faculty of Harvard Business School, where I've developed, along with another professor, a new course in the MBA program and in the Exec Ed program. So it's a full credit MBA course, basically called Investing in the 21st Century, Risk, Return, and Impact, which seems to be a pretty common theme here. In fact, we wrote a case on TPG Rise, I did, and taught it earlier this year, and Marianne was in our class. So I'm going to come at it from the HBS angle and a more macro angle with the kind of backdrop as to what Vice President Gore said yesterday and what Ronnie said in his opening comments, that there is a huge investment opportunity on one hand, and there's a massive amount of liquidity and capital in the world on the other, but somehow they aren't meeting. And the question really is why? And I would say, just getting back to the context of this panel, one of the key questions, one of the key reasons is that investors want the metrics. Otherwise, investors are not going to invest. And just as Ronnie talked about the whole issue of focusing on impact measurement going forward, every investor wants metrics. So the question really then in our mind is that let's look at the landscape and break it down into public and private markets, just like any investor would do. You have different asset classes. And so if you look at the public markets, essentially, if you look at the various ways people play impact in the public markets, the screens. Well, people will do screens based on values. There's no evidence, and I don't think there ever will be, that those screens actually change behavior or those screens actually reduce cost of capital. The second reason people look at so-called impact investing is by integrating ESG into their investment decisions. That, I think, is just a very, very compelling argument where we need to start focusing on metrics because, for example, generations, David Blood's comments yesterday, is that people don't have enough information to make thoughtful decisions around impact assessment into the investment process. And while people have started talking about ESG integration, et cetera, we've done a lot of work with large institutional investors, pension plans, et cetera, where they talk about it, they want to do it, but really don't know how and don't have the information to do it. So I would argue that a key thing of bringing that capital that needs to come into the impact area to change the world and deal with SDG issues, to bridge that gap, it's got to be in the context of an investing opportunity. So on the public markets, I would say, whether it's be SASB or anything else, that we've got to bring metrics that have impact in both from investors' perspective, but also from a regulation perspective. You know, from policy, we've talked about policy being a big issue. What are policymakers doing to make sure that capital is flowing in this area? So that's one. Second is on the private side, and I'll just wrap up in a quick minute here. We have on the private side at HBS also embarked on another study, but focused really building on the great work which you and your team have done, Clara, on mapping private equity funds into certain areas and seeing what drives their behavior and what drives capital going into them and how can they market themselves more effectively. And what we found, so we basically have done a deep dive on 8 funds with their consent and with their involvement. I can't really name them around the world. And what we found is that while they may fit into this bucket of market-based, and most of them are market-based investors, so-called market return investors, they will also fall into the spectrum that you have in your framework of do no harm to the other side of doing really, really good. But the way they actually implement things is hugely different. And we are kind of embarking on this study, and what we are finding is that while certain impact private equity funds will position themselves certain ways, they just haven't seen enough metrics to really implement in a consistent manner. So what I mean by that is that you'll have the marketing document of 4 or 5 funds looking exactly the same, but the way they go about it is very different. And so I think what's important from an investor perspective and from, again, the metrics perspective is making sure that investors have the ability, whether it be in the diligence process, the evaluation process, going through that whole process of mapping what investors are doing with the opportunity that exists.
Great, thank you so much, Bikram. And I think it's a sign of maturation of our community that there's an HBS course now devoted to this work. So thank you for sharing that. I am going to just to flag. I'm going to come back to a question though, because I think as you've highlighted the imperative of metrics for investors to have confidence in decision making. I think the flip side, though, what it invites is the question on the demand side. Because at the end of the day, the impact that we are all seeking to enable and catalyze is being generated by the enterprises. It is being generated in the first mile by the enterprises. And how do we ensure that the frameworks and the metrics are actually fit for purpose for the underlying impact that's being generated at that first mile level? So I'm going to come back to that as a question, just to flag it. But Anuvamit, allow me to ask you to share your opening thoughts about navigating through this fragmented and noisy conversation at times.
Thank you, Laurie. So my introduction here is as an investor with LGT. And, I agree with all the comments of my other panelists, fellow panelists here. So methodology, metrics, frameworks, principles, all important. Vikram's point around metrics, investors requiring metrics, that is a very valid point. However, my confusion over the last many years has been that we end up collecting a lot of metrics and we have complex and sophisticated methodologies and frameworks. But at the end of the day, everyone walks away feeling as if we haven't addressed the question completely, or it's a job well done, and there's something that's missing. So just looking back on all of this and the challenges with measuring impact, I think a lot of that challenge doesn't actually lie in the tools that we deploy, which we're talking about, which is the metrics and the methodology, but perhaps the way we think about it now, and especially as we are constructing our own impact framework, is that the challenge lies really upfront in having a very clear definition of what impact we're trying to achieve. And there, to the point that SDGs are a good set of goals to align ourselves around, but are fairly broad. So, how do you then take that as a clear definition? And perhaps it's counterintuitive here, but I think a narrower definition, but a clearer one actually goes further along. The second point that I'll make is that understanding the instrument that you're using to have an impact. So as investors, we may use capital. As being in government, you may use policy. But understanding how that instrument will work to make an impact, and then tying that into understanding whether you control an output or an outcome, or you can influence one, is actually is also a difference, so that we don't end up measuring something that we don't really control or are marginally influencing. So for me, a lot of the work actually doesn't lie in so much. Of course, the framework has to be thorough and rigorous, but it sort of lies up front in when we're defining our investment strategy and then tying that in pretty closely to the impact that we want to have. So then, it's much easier at the back end for us.
I think that's a terrific reminder of the need to calibrate the scope of your question relative to the activity that you're undertaking. So I think that's a really helpful and a bit of practical advice also for practitioners. So thank you, Randiva, for sharing that. I want to circle back on the supply and demand side perspective and tension, if you will, at times that we do here in the community. We started our day today celebrating 2 millennial honorees who are entrepreneurs on the ground delivering extraordinary, measurable impact in their businesses. And then we're having a conversation at a very high level of how do we galvanize critical capital that ultimately can find its way to businesses like that. And Clara, I wanted to ask you to give your thoughts on the supply and the demand side perspective, and what do we need to be mindful of to ensure that we don't have an unintentional blind spot as we're trying to make the connective tissue between the supply and the demand side. And I also, just to make sure that everybody in the audience is aware, I'd like to ask you to say a word about the impact management project, because it was referenced by a couple of your fellow panelists. I know there was a big announcement last week in New York at the UN. So just to level set for the audience, if you could tackle both of those, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely, and they go together, because the impact management project that Laurie is referencing, which we've been running for the last 2 years and is now going ahead in a slightly different form, it's been a collaborative effort by thousands of organizations to agree on what we mean by impact. When we each say, my organization's having a real impact, are we actually saying something which can be compared and contrasted? Do we have the same underlying fundamentals that we agree on when we use that word? And then from there, we've been able to pass lots of different things, including the types of data that you would expect to find in any impact report or any impact statement. And that process of converging around those fundamentals involved supply and demand. It was essential that there was a balance across the value chain of participants, and obviously also across geographies and across disciplines. Not just the impact investing tribe, for example. This involved multinational corporations, institutional investors that only focus on ESG risk management. It included social scientists and development experts. It was a deliberately diverse mix. And the supply and demand conversation was one of the most interesting in terms of people's perspectives. But where it became obvious that we were onto something as a global community was when we were forced to, because of the number of different languages involved in the project, distill impact down to very, very simple words that everyone could say, you know what, I can't dispute that. That must be relevant when I'm talking about impact. And those 5 words were what, who, how much, contribution, and risk. So what was what outcome, who was who is it for, how much was how much change, and that's scale, depth, duration, and rate. Contribution was what's your role in creating that change, and risk was what's the likelihood that it doesn't turn out as you expect. And because those became indisputable, it completely changed the supply-demand conversation, because the enterprises then reflected on the data that they were collecting and recognized that actually the data that's relevant for each of those 5 dimensions I've just described is very often commercial data. It's very important to them to understand not just the number of products that they sell, but what that product does to someone's life, because that's useful information for them to sell better and to design better. It's very useful for them to understand who and the demographic, so they can start to segment their population, their customer base, or their employee base. And it's very useful for them to understand the degree of change, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we can try and do that more often, try and get down to simple concepts and language, it will change the mindset of the entrepreneur, who half the time just doesn't understand the conceptual terminology and logic that's being forced on them.
I think it's a great reminder, and also half the time just needs to get on with running their business. But it's the relevance of what we are tracking to the fundamental business that's also relevant for the investor. So thank you for that. And those who are not familiar with the impact management project, I would encourage you to log on and to look at it, because it is an incredibly accessible framework approach, I would say, to the conversation that allows you to really recognize your own actions in context and a broad array of participants. So thank you for sharing
Laurie,
that.
all I would also say is for those who are interested in the puzzle pieces that I referenced earlier,
Yes.
you know, the project going forwards is all about threading together all of the different elements that Laurie said had the potential to cause confusion. So for those who want to participate in that process, let us know.
You will find your cohesion through the impact management project. That's the promise. Vikram, I want to come back to you. So we've teased out a little bit, or the potential tension between the supply and the demand side, which can be reconciled. But I wanted to ask you a different question on that. Is that one challenge that we find when we're talking to institutional investors in particular is this ex-ante expectation of proof point. And oftentimes what we're doing in these impact investment interventions is we have an ex-ante hypothesis that is grounded in some degree of data, but we're proving as we go. And there is a degree of courage that you're taking as an investor. You have a conviction. You have indicators. You're challenging yourself as you're going along. What are those indicators? Am I on track or not on track to realize that impact? But we worry a little bit that this ex-ante expectation, we're getting higher and higher and higher in that expectation set and keeping capital on the sidelines. What's your thought there?
I think that's a fair thought in terms of fair kind of observation. I think the case that this group needs to make, and the point being that people who don't necessarily believe it or are skeptical about it have not flown to Delhi to be here. So the question really is, what message goes from this room to potential investors? And I would say that we just have to make the case that this is better investing. I kind of go through the spectrum of how can we have better philanthropy, and we've talked a lot about that in other panels. I would just like to focus the thought on this is better investing. And what does that mean? What that means is that if you don't factor in ESG into your investing process in the long term, you're going to make bad investment decisions. So that's where I think that there's the missing link, because we tend to market this as you're trying to do good for the world, you're trying to change things. I think we need to market ourselves, in addition to changing the world, and there's a role for that, is that this is better investing. If you do not factor in climate, if you don't factor in gender equality, which results in better decision making, if you don't factor in good governance in companies and evaluate that, and you don't have the metrics to actually make decisions around those three things, you will not invest, or you should not invest. And so I think it gets back to the fact of making the case of better investing. So that's one. The other case of better investing, and it's come up in other panels, there is a 3 to 4 billion person market which is not being served. And there are not enough products and services that are being targeted to that. And that we see in our HBS research too, is that if you look at those 8 funds I mentioned, a lot of them actually do not focus on how much impact am I generating every year. What they're saying is that I am targeting this kind of income population. That income population has products and services which are not being delivered to it. That is not going to be some adjunct activity of mine. That is my core business. That's what social entrepreneurs do. That's their core business. That's how they make money. They don't have the luxury of making money through rich people and they're doing some cross-subsidy for poor people. That's how they make money. So I think there too, when you go to a capital provider, the case has really got to be made that this is a great market opportunity, and here are the metrics which show that these people can basically buy these products and you can make them at a price point that's profitable. So I think a lot of positioning and issues I find, and I put this on because I've been in the financial services business for 25 years before I started teaching, is that the pitch right now is not right. I think the pitch has got to be, this is better investing, and then people ask, well, where are the metrics? And that's what we need to focus on, get the metrics in place so that people can make better investment decisions.
Yeah, fantastic, and a great suggestion for all of us. Yeah, applause warranted. And it is a good reminder. We talked about it, and Ronnie talked about it in his opening remarks, and has been consistent in talking about it. The positioning of what we're doing is critically important to galvanize more actors and more capital. Is it then also, can I just ask you, the case that as you're having the conversation at the business school, where you're shaping actually minds and approaches going forward, are you presenting the risk-return impact paradigm as the universal paradigm for all investment decisions, not limited to a special subset of undertakings?
Yeah, so I think the focus, for example, of this course is not the people who actually believe. I think it's an investing course. It's positioned as a finance course. It's, we've got hardcore number analysis and valuation and everything else. And the case being made there is that if you, again, getting back to it, that a lot of the cases, the case that we've written on the TPG Rise Fund, it's about making an investment in Everfi, which is a software company in the US focused on educating people on sexual assault and alcohol abuse, and how they translate that into actual specific metrics. So, but the point being that is a big opportunity because the universities need it, et cetera, et cetera. So you look at the return, which is, okay, it's a SaaS-based company, there's scalability. You look at the risk being that you could have government intervention, but then you look at the impact, and that's all embedded. So what we're trying to do is change the paradigm, which is adding impact to the risk and return framework. And again, it's the first steps. It's the first year we're actually teaching the course. There's a fair amount of interest in it. And not just on the MBA side. We're looking at exec ed, but we're also using HBS as a convening mechanism. So we had a group of pension plans come in, some of the largest pension plans, including PGGM, who's featured in your study. And all of them talk about, yeah, we want to do good, but we have a fiduciary responsibility, so we need to make better investment decisions. And I think that's the thing. This is not some side activity. The other piece of the course, just to finish on that, is how do we make government spending more effective? It gets back to the earlier panel. How do we actually create, so we've got a case on social investment bonds. Tracy comes to our class every year, or came to our class this year. Is how do we actually make, and how do students and investors look at this purely from a clinical lens? What's my return and how am I getting it? So I think our focus is really getting the mindset into investment mode, and that bringing impact into the risk-return analysis is good investing.
Terrific. I think we would all take comfort of the fact that it is a mainstream undertaking, and the centralization of the way in which you're articulating it is very welcome.
We have a lot of people who've been in the private equity industry and hedge fund industry in our course.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Great. Anup, I wanted to get back to you. You referenced the Sustainable Development Goals, and you said they're relevant, but they're not really providing the specificity of direction for an investor who wants to develop a strategy and execute on it. And yet, they are attracting a lot of attention, resonance, accessibility, because the language is simple. The graphics are quite attractive, and there's a kind of an excitement about them. And of course, they're terribly important. So how do you think about the SDGs, or how would you suggest we think about the SDGs in the context of the conversation about measurement and management of impact? Are they relevant at all, or how do we create a linkage with the SDGs?
So, Lori, thanks. I think SDGs are very relevant because they have, after a long time, given people a common language, investors and others alike, advisors, governments. They've given all of us a common language. And a common set of goals. And as you said, there's a simplicity about them. There's good colors, so we like all of that, and that's great. And there's 17 goals, so that's good. We can get our heads around those 17 goals. What then starts happening is that if you looked at a goal like no poverty, now there's 160, as you know, there's 169 targets that lie beneath those 17 goals. And I think it's a great starting point for all of us, but I think then tying into tying it into the earlier discussion around what is it that we want to measure. If we were to measure ourselves very broadly around these 17 goals, I think that becomes a slightly nebulous and a difficult task to demonstrate our impact at the end of the day. So the way we're thinking, I can talk about how we're thinking about it. We've actually, exactly what I said, we've sort of taken our investment strategy and we've linked that very closely. We've started with the SDGs. We've then taken very specific SDGs that we think that we will be able to address through our investment goals. So we have split up the SDGs. So for example, within SDG 1, which is no poverty, we've said that there's a specific number of targets underneath, but we can address target 1.4 because that relates to providing financial services, and so on and so forth. So we've done that for SDG 2, we've done that for all the other SDGs, and then we've been pretty selective in how we go about it. And that then relates to our investment strategy, which is around the same sectors, and we can then, hopefully, as we go through the various layers of our impact framework, we can eventually demonstrate clearly that this is what we had said we'd set out to do, and this is where we've ended up at the end of the day.
So fantastic. And again, it builds on your opening comment about that need to calibrate and be specific in what you're undertaking to do. So thank you for explaining how you're working with the SDGs. Clara, I'm curious, because you just did come back from New York. The SDGs, obviously, there you are at the UN meetings, and then thinking about how you framed your opening remarks as the pieces of the puzzle. How do you see the SDGs fitting into this conversation, either as an enhancement of what we're endeavoring to do or not?
So when I said that the Impact Management Project is going forwards, it is through a network of standard-setting organizations who are using the consensus achieved to date to really help them converge on what it means to manage impact end-to-end and help the market have a very clear understanding of that. And I reference that network of organizations because the UN Development Programme, UNDP, which has over 170 offices around the world and is really the implementing arm of the UN for the SDGs, is one of the organizations in the network, and they play a very special role because what they want to do is say, if we can get to agreement on what it means to manage impact well, then the UNDP can really say, this is what all businesses and all investors need to do to achieve the SDGs, and they can put a seal around that and provide great clarity. Now, the reason why we, as we were reflecting on who should be in the network, thought that the UN and specifically UNDP had such a powerful role to play is because we do think that the SDGs are a critical lens for impact management. I talked to you about 5 dimensions: what, who, how much, etc. The what is most of the SDGs. When people say they provide us with common goals, they actually don't provide us with common goals on the who and how much. They provide us with common goals on the outcome. And if you go through all the way through to the indicators beyond the targets, which gets even more specific, most of the indicators are framed as percentage of population that is either experiencing something positive or not experiencing something negative. And those indicators actually, that when you really do kind of bother to go through and find them, they are very specific. Yes. And what they enable you to do is say, okay, how does my strategy ultimately help affect that percentage of that population? And you can kind of map backwards. So I do think they have an incredibly important role to play. The only thing I would caution, though, is as we get obsessed with metrics, we really need to step back and think about the design of metrics, because there is a danger that we are obsessing with everyone reporting metrics like number of people employed, for example. And unless we actually construct metrics with a view to achieving the SDGs, for example, which cover the quality of those jobs, the change that the populations experienced, were they unemployed before, were they not, unless you have that multidimensionality captured within a metric, it's never going to be comparable. And what we mustn't forget is that we can report all the metrics we like. If we're not actually comparing metrics across and using it to decide what's better and what's worse, nothing's going to change.
I think it's such a good reminder, Clara. And what we often talk about in our work is that it's not just the quantum of capital we're driving towards. Of course, that's critically important. But it's the distribution of that capital along the full spectrum of opportunities, and importantly about the impact, the specificity of impact. And your comments very much echo Anuba's comment, and we do need to be looking at that specificity. And but having, I think, the SDGs allows us to have a common conversation around perhaps an ultimate alignment in a particular objective, but not forgetting that specificity. Marianne, I'm curious, just to pick up on Clara's last point, how you, we have now the RISE Lab, so a specific entity within the broader organization, how are you positioning yourselves to look into the impact results, and how is it informing, or how are you positioning it to inform the strategic decisions you're taking, the investment assessments you're making? What's the linkage there? It's not just gathering the information, but how are you actually using it as part of the process?
Sure. It's actually entirely interwoven and interrelated into decision making. And I think what Vikram said about decision making and what you highlighted is exactly right. This is the power of, if we're going to change things, that this has to be, the conversation has to start with, was the decision up front, and then how are we managing decisions on the back end? And so in the situation of the RISE Fund, we, for every assessment that comes through, which at this point is a quite scaled endeavor, we are assessing an impact from an estimated standpoint by turning to third-party research to say, what is the greatest amount of confidence that we could put in whether an intervention is going to have impact, how much will that impact be worth, and then how can we hold ourselves accountable to it based on the risks that could be there. That's a conversation that is actually quite deep, and it's happening right up front during the and in parallel with the financial decisions. It means that sometimes TPG does not have something invested in RISE. It does not qualify as impact. It goes over to the growth arm. And that's actually a wonderful outlet because it's allowing people to have integrity in the actual measurement and say, this is where we're going to hold the bar. So there's a lot more that goes into that I'm happy to talk about, but I think that that's the core of it, is turning to research to increase confidence on the ingoing piece.
Thank you, and the integral nature of how you're
Yes.
looking at it. I think the question that it raises, and it goes back a little bit to the academic pursuit, do we see this movement requiring third-party validation? So it's one thing, you as an investment professional and in your organization, to say we're making these considerations integral to our decision-making. But do we see this movement actually leading to third-party independent validation of ultimately the claims that we're making on impact? Marianne, maybe first, and then Anuba.
Sure. It raises a question about the natural evolution of an industry. And we are at a point where, for at least 3 reasons, we need to move into that space of third party and other types of specialization. One is for effectiveness, the second is because of scale, and the third is because of technology, which was brought up in the last panel. From an effectiveness standpoint, we are talking about sums of money at this point that we are no longer in experimentation mode. And fortunately, there are tremendous numbers of researchers out there who may not have the perfect piece of research, but who have spent their lives thinking about how to increase the productivity of maize in sub-Saharan Africa such that they can have impact in the communities they're working with, or take any other of many fields. We can tap into that. And it's crucial, not just from it's really both a moral perspective in the way we choose to allocate our funds, as well as an effectiveness perspective on the return on that capital. So that's one piece. The second piece is the scale. As we get to scale, we're going to have more and more multi-sectoral funds, multi-sectoral situations where people are trying to make decisions and deploy capital very rapidly, and that requires specialization and inputs into that, whether it's third-party certification or third-party research into the decision-making. And the third piece is technology, right? We now have the ability to do things on mobile phones like Lean Data is doing, or I was speaking with the chief scientist from NASA last week to visualize and see things from space about traffic patterns in rural districts, in communities that we were never able to see foot traffic before. We can use technology on the back end to understand things much more, in a much more specialized way than we could before. So I think it is a big piece of this movement.
Thank you for that. And Anuba, what's your thought?
Well, I agree with what Marianne says, number of things, but, and I see how this can require special audits, and especially given the needs that we talked about earlier around metrics from investors and them wanting more, and wanting external validation because we don't have a clear idea about impact frameworks just yet and a common idea. But I do have to ask the question around, if I look at it as an investor, and we would never outsource or sort of get validation for our investment strategy at the end of the day. that rests squarely with the investment team, that rests within the organization. So to that extent, I think if we are seeking external validation on impact, it shows to me that it's not as core to our main business or as core to us as our investment strategy is. And to me, till we sort of keep doing that, it's really not going to be as fundamental to our investment analysis. So I see a need for it in a sense, but I also think there shouldn't be that sort of dichotomy at the end.
Yeah, I think the notion, I think if I'm hearing Marianne correctly, is that we do need to own it as investment professionals, but does it enhance the recognition of our work by having third-party validation, not an outsourcing of the undertaking, but validation of what we are sharing and unearthing? I think that was right. So I think you're absolutely right, though. The power of the execution needs to stay with those who are doing it. We're running short of time. I want to just, there'll be an afternoon session as well, because I think there's an interesting tension between creating coherence and having some generally applicable reference points with the degree of specificity needed to do this well, which I think is the afternoon session actually on standardization. But I wanted to ask the panelists their closing thoughts. One piece of advice for each of us, whether we are an investor, a policymaker, you can direct it to an audience or make it a general comment, but a piece of advice of how we can really have further momentum on the criticality of our impact management and measurement activities. Anuba, I'm going to start with you and run down the other way.
I would just say keep it simple. Complexity will sort of give us less information about the very thing we're trying to get information about, which is impact.
Keep it simple. Vikram.
Yeah, I would say, let not the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? I mean, there's this constant thing of trying to become perfect. I mean, we talk about risk and return. I think there's still debates on, FASB's been around, we try to get accounting standards for 100 years, and there's still debates about what accounting standards and what rules within FASB should apply or not. We assume that risk management and risk analysis is a given. It's not. There's a huge amounts of debate as to how one should think about risk. So I think we should compliment ourselves that we've done enormous progress and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But I would say that, so that's one thing. I mean, I think we should continue that. The second thing, since we're in India, we have a lot of focus on the private equity side in India, on the private markets. But a message for the leadership in India would be, we need to get the public markets focused on this. And the public markets are not focused on this enough in terms of really factoring in ESG and other key criteria into their business operations. And from an investment community and a policy community, I would say that's absolutely critical.
Terrific. Thank you, Vikram. Marianne.
It's important enough, I'm going to say it again, even though it's the same thing, which is do not let the theoretically perfect be the enemy of the substantially better than where we are today.
Great. And Clara.
I think that we are getting to a point where impact measurement and management can no longer be self-taught. And so as we do that, as we converge around what it means to do that well, let's look to a future where every business and every investment is competing on how much impact it can have, not on its methodology.
Fantastic. Focus on the end result. That's fantastic. Please. This is a conversation that will continue. It is front and central to everything that we are doing as a community and as a movement and as a revolution. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.